Hi, this is Laura from Washington State. I support Adoptees On because finding this adoptee community gave me the strength to move through my next phase of healing. We get something out of each episode, and I want Haley and our community to reach and help as many adoptees as possible. Please join me in supporting this important work.
You are listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. This is episode 192, Susan Devan Harness. I'm your host, Haley Radke. Our guest today is scholar and author Susan Devan Harness. Susan shares from an anthropological perspective about the policies in place behind the Indian Adoption Project and why Indigenous placement with white families was preferred by the government. She also shares about some of the current action in the U.S. courts to undermine and remove the Indian Child Welfare Act, and why it is so critical for us to pay attention to the cascading effects this could have. We do get personal, too, about what happened for Susan in her 40s, as she unraveled what being adopted really meant, being separated both from her original family and from her original culture. There are a couple of opportunities to hear more from Susan in the weeks ahead, so make sure to stay to the end of the show and I'll tell you about those. We wrap up with some recommended resources, and as always, links to everything we'll be talking about today are on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I am so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On Susan Devan Harness. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you. I am so happy to be here, and I appreciate you reaching out to invite me.
Well, I so respect your work. I've read Bitterroot, and I know the tremendous scholarly research you've added to the adoption community. So it's an honor, truly. But I'd love to, before we get to that, I'd love it if you would share some of your story with us.
So I was born in 1959, and I was removed from my family at 18 months. For neglect. And neglect is kind of one of those shadow words. It covers a lot of issues. But neglect for me, according to files that were provided to me surreptitiously by a social worker, neglect for me sounded like our mother had a history of disappearing for days or weeks or months at a time. And nobody knew where she was. And in these times, she would typically leave us with family members, a lot of times with her mom. But her mom was also watching the kids of her other children, which is really typical in Native families and, American Indian families. But she had a lot of kids. She had 9 kids, and probably the first four or five were the ones that struggled the most with parenting. My mother left me and my younger brother in the care of our 6-year-old sister, and somebody called social workers. And so when they arrived, my file said that my body was covered with infected mosquito bites, that I had open sores in my diaper area, because they couldn't determine when my diaper had been changed, that I was hungry, and they couldn't determine when I had last eaten. So, of course, they removed me from the home. They moved my younger brother from the home, and we both got placed into different foster situations. And so I went to a guardian, and I was there for 6 months, and then I was placed with my white parents. And I lived in rural Montana. Rural Montana, I argue, is second only to Alaska as far as racism against American Indians. I grew up knowing very well how white America felt about American Indians. And throughout school, it was amazing how many kids I knew, and it's usually guys, would come up. And I don't know why they felt this was a conversation that I'd be interested in. But they always told me about their brother or their uncle or their dad or their grandfather having a run-in with the Indians. And this is Montana, home of 7 Indian reservations. So that wouldn't be an uncommon thing. So I grew up feeling very uncomfortable with who I was because I was getting all these silent and kind of covert messages that I was going to be mean, or that I was going to be violent, or that I was not really very intelligent, that the mothers of white boys didn't really want their sons dating me because I was probably going to get pregnant and ruin their futures. That's what Indian women did. And so I really struggled with finding any kind of a healthy identity for a long time. And I won't say that, you see my skin color. I can't pass as white. I mean, that's not even a possibility. And so I always maintained, people would ask me, well, what are you? What nationality are you? And I would always say, well, I'm Indian, and I'm half. My father is white, but nobody really knows what kind of white he is. And so it's just white on the birth certificate. And so I would just say, I'm Indian or I'm Native American, because they weren't asking about the white side of me. And I knew that. So it took me a long time to, I think, finally start pushing it back against who I should be. And it took me into my 40s into establishing who I was. And at that point, that's when I did the research into what would become mixing cultural identities through transracial adoption for my master's in cultural anthropology, because I wanted to know why people felt they had the right to tell me who I was, and why other people felt they had the right to tell me who I was not. Because I was sitting on the cusp of white America and Indigenous America. White America is looking at me saying, well, you're Indian. You're not these things. And in other words, you're not high up on the social hierarchy like everybody else here. You have some caveats. And then when I go back to the reservation, I'm referred there, not anymore, but when I was younger, I was definitely referred there as an apple, red on the outside, white on the inside. And I mean, that was the biggest slam. And the first time I heard it in my late teens or early 20s, I was absolutely shocked, because I just thought, well, I'm just like you. I look like you. I came from you. I was removed. And so, yeah, in my 40s, I finally decided, okay, I'm done playing this game, and I'm going to change the rules, because I'm going to set the rules.
Can you tell us a little bit about going into academia and anthropology in particular? I know that when you were first in university in your 20s, you share some of that in Bitterroot, and there was some, I don't know, like some folks trying to dissuade you from doing that. But can you talk a little bit about what anthropology is and what drew you to it, and maybe about how part of that is identity seeking?
So I'd been drawn to anthropology since I was a senior in high school. That's when I first took my first anthropology class. And, I love learning about people. And I love learning about people all over the world and why we do the things we do. And I have my bachelor's in anthropology, and that was a start. But when I decided to do my cultural anthropology master's, what I really wanted to do is I wanted to look at adoption through a very different lens. What I was going to figure out in the research, that Emile Durkheim had come up with the idea of social facts. And social facts are all those unstated and invisible messages you get about a society's belief about something. So if you follow that, then all of a sudden, so why do so many people in the societies that I was part of, white society in the United States, why do they feel that American Indians are bad? Because that is kind of a given throughout. I mean, it's, you get these groups that are just like, oh, we support you and you've been wronged and blah, blah, blah. But, the average Joe is going to say, yeah, Indians, they're just no damn good. So why is that? Why is that? And the more I delved into it, the more I looked into history and I looked into policy, and child placement fit right into both of those things. Like, how can you break up Indian tribes? How can you break up the tribal communities of American Indians? Because moving them, objectifying them, and moving them across the land to various and sundry reservation areas didn't do it. Taking them and moving them into urban centers didn't do it because they kept coming home. Putting them in American Indian boarding schools didn't do that because, again, they still had contact with their families and their communities, and they kept coming back like pieces of mercury. So that's when you take a child and you remove them from their parents, their communities, their tribes. You close and seal those records so that they don't know who they are, and you place them in white families. Now, once you do that, and this is going to start sounding like a conspiracy theory, so just stick with me. But once you do that, if that is successful, and I argue that American Indian transracial adoption was the most tragically successful assimilation policy to date. You can start fragmenting communities. You can start arguing who's Indian and who's not Indian, who has the cultural rights to be labeled American Indian. You can fragment us. You can take our land. You can destroy all those treaties. And now you've got a great sowing area for resource extraction. And that it's been about the land. It has always been about the land. That these are just kind of undercover enough for the average American public to think that it's about child welfare. It's not about child welfare.
Well, I've heard people refer to, in Canada, the 60s scoop and residential schools as a form of genocide. And I imagine you could apply that as well to what happened in the United States, was very similar. And when we were speaking on the phone to arrange this, you expressed this passion that people really would understand what's happening right now with the Indian Child Welfare Act, so ICWA, and what's happening in the court system. Are you willing to talk about that a little bit and teach us what's kind of going on so we can really see, like, is it a conspiracy theory or is it like actually happening?
Well, it's actually happening. So the Goldwater Institute is a conservative right-wing think tank. It's funded by the Koch brothers, whose billions of dollars have come from resource extraction. And what they're trying to do is there have been at least 12 lawsuits that are moving through different courts in different states to try to overturn the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978. What they're arguing is that act is unconstitutional because it's based on race, which is a bunch of hooey. We didn't argue that we were racially different. We didn't argue that we were Indians. We were told who we were. All of our treaties have been based on that identity that was given to us. all of the agreements, all of the legalities, all of the removals, all of the other stuff have come to us based on an identity that we were given. So to me, for them to turn around and say, well, that's unconstitutional because you're basing it on race, when we are the ones who established the Indian Child Welfare Act, when we pushed it through as Indigenous people, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Mm. You can't say that this is, that you're Indians and because of this, you need to do this and this and this and this, or blah, blah, blah. And then turn around and say, yeah, you can't keep your kids based on race. Like, it doesn't work that way. Mm-hmm. And so what I wanted to do, though, just briefly, is to go back to the 60s scoop. I argue the Indian Adoption Project was our view of the 60s scoop. The Indian Adoption Project was a handshake agreement between the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Child Welfare League of America. And it was designed to address the social ills that were running rampant on the Indian reservations: inadequate housing, poverty, substance and alcohol use, poor health, horrible literacy rates. And so if they could take children from that environment and place them in white America, then they would grow up having been removed from the cesspools, and it would be a clean slate. So let's take that apart a little bit. Number one, we didn't create the cesspools.
Quote unquote. You're making your air quotes.
Yes, we didn't create the quote unquote cesspools. This is what happens when you take culture and you bring it to the brink of extinction. And it was brought to the brink of extinction because of the Indian Wars, because of the constant warfare that happened west of the Mississippi to just about every generation of tribal people. The number of men, women, and children that were killed in those wars to protect manifest destiny is astronomical. I look at myself and I think I am so lucky that I'm even walking this earth right now. So I argue that the genocides had already happened. What things like the Indian Adoption Project tried to do is they tried to make it was an assimilation program. And if you look at it, there's some pretty dark implications there too, in terms of land acquisition, is that if you and I can get on the same page of Western values and the importance of agriculture and the importance of mining and the importance of economy and the importance of all these things, then you know what? You'll see that you don't need that land. You'll see that you don't, if you're just like us, then you're going to believe the same things we believe. And unfortunately, that's what's happened with a lot of the adoptees, is that at some point in their life, and I mean, this is me included, became so white that we couldn't understand the Indigenous point of view, and we couldn't understand what was at stake. And in order to do that, you really have to feel confident enough to step outside of yourself and take a look at it through a different lens.
Mm. So I know in your research for your master's project, which turned into this book, Mixing Cultural Identities Through Transracial Adoption, Outcomes of the Indian Adoption Project, that you spoke with adoptees for hundreds of hours. And I'm curious how that impacted you personally, Susan. Like what shifted for you, if anything?
Things didn't shift for me. My shift had occurred like about a year earlier. I mean, and it happened quickly. Yeah, it really did. It was like I'm Indian and nobody's going to tell me what that means. But talking with other adoptees made me aware, even though we had unique experiences, there was a common thread that ran through all of these. And that the common thread was racism. The common thread was abuse. The common thread was, if we tried to go home, too many of us were not accepted. That most of us landed in this area in between. We're too white to be Indian, we're too Indian to be white. What do you do with that when you live in a binary culture that requires you to be one thing or another?
There's a really, I don't even know. I was going to say poignant moment in your book, but I don't know if that's the right word for it. You're talking to someone, you're talking to Albert and saying, what would it have been like for me if I hadn't been adopted? And he says, don't ever ask that. You left, you escaped this place. Don't question whether or not it was right. Look around you. How many of these people are accomplishing things in their life? You escaped and you be glad of it. I don't ever want to hear those words from you again. And I remember just like viscerally feeling in my gut, I thought, this is it. You're neither here nor there. That's exactly what you're describing to us now. And you captured it so perfectly when you write about that moment.
That's the other piece that I think was so important when I wrote Bitterroot, is I came back to my family. And even though I'd been in reunion with them since 1993, it's not an easy thing. It's not the Hallmark Channel. It's not that you run into each other's arms and I was floored when Uncle Albert said that. It's like, what? Like, I'm here. Like, isn't that important? And it was important. But, to him, he lived the poverty. He lived the racism. He lived the life that I think he believed in, and many believed. If you could escape from that, you could become something. And people often ask me, in fact, I was challenged by a lawyer, an adoption lawyer one time at one of the keynotes that I gave. He said, but your adoption had benefits, because I guarantee you, he said, you wouldn't be standing at this podium talking if you hadn't been. And I said, my adoption did provide me benefits. Absolutely. I lived in a safe neighborhood. I lived in a, middle class, kind of upper middle class home. I had a college degree. I graduated high school first, got a college degree. And I said, and you're right, I probably wouldn't be standing up at this podium. But I said, you need to keep in mind that I paid a high price for those benefits.
And when we read your memoir, your adoption is no happy fairy tale situation. So, yeah.
Well, and I do want to say, I didn't think that it was horrible at the time, because you know what? When you look at the cross section of society, there are a lot of kids growing up in families with alcoholism. There are a lot of kids growing up in families of divorce. There are a lot of kids growing up in families where a parent has a mental health issue. And it bothers me when people point that out of like, oh my gosh, she just came from this just really dysfunctional place. It's like, I guarantee you, my reservation family was a little bit more dysfunctional. It's that's what I really wanted to do with Bitterroot, is let's have an honest conversation about what adoption is. I'm not a person that feels that adoption is ever going to go away. I don't think it will. I think it needs to change. And I think we need to have real conversations about what that change looks like. I mean, I'll be honest, the war in Syria, what mother would not want her children to be given a safe place to grow up in? Mothers want their children to survive almost at all costs. When you saw babies being lifted over the wall that Trump built, mothers want their babies to survive. We need to keep that in mind, and we need to treat that instinct with respect. However, and that's why I come back to, even though my adoption wasn't peachy keen, I don't think it was that different than a lot of non-adopted people in the homes that they grow up in. What I dealt with was the racism. What I dealt with was really outside of my family. Those are the conversations we need to have, is what happens when you take a child and place them in a racist environment. What does racism mean? What is it telling you? How does it show up? It's not people in white pointy caps wandering around with torches. It's the person next door that is complaining about how many brown people are suddenly in town. It's the person who doesn't want their child to play with somebody of a certain class or a certain race, and those two a lot of times are interchangeable. And so they'll exclude them on the playground. It's a lot of little things.
I speak to that briefly because a lot of people that listen to this podcast are like me. I'm a white woman. And, as I read your book, I will freely admit to you, there's so many things in your story and expressing, especially your criticism of adoption in various ways, that I really deeply identify with. They're very resonant for me. And even that feeling of in between two places. But I never want to give the impression that as a white, domestic, closed adoptee, that I lost the same things as you did. And I do see this almost constantly co-opting by white adopted people of transracial adoptee narratives or trans country adoptee narratives, and especially by white women. And so first I want to say that I condemn that, and I don't think it's right. And hopefully I haven't participated in that, but even asking you this question, it's, asking for your emotional labor again. But what do you see? But I'm going to do it anyway. Do you see that? And how do you tell someone like me to be an ally to Indigenous people, and especially Indigenous adoptees who were placed in white families? Yikes, that was scary to ask. I feel sick about it.
But the thing is that I think we shouldn't be scared to ask questions. When you ask questions respectfully, that opens a conversation, and it opens a way to increase your world perspective in ways that you may not have known. And so I think it's really important to have those conversations. And I think it's also really important for me to be able to explain without anger, without blame, because then it's not a conversation. It turns into something else. I think I don't really know how to answer your question other than I did lose a lot. I lost a lot culturally. And I needed that cultural piece to bring me in balance with who people thought I was. I mean, it's, there were just so many white people that that othered me without even realizing. And it's just like, well, do you know your own language? No, I don't know my own language. Well, do you know your songs? No, I don't know my songs. Do you have an Indian name? No, I was never given an Indian name. you know, even going to the doctor, what diseases does your mother carry? Well, I have no idea. I don't know. I was adopted. Othering in the classroom, like I wrote in Bitterroot, when a professor who was a perfectly wonderful professor and a very deep thinking philosophical person tries to show his awareness of my ethnicity in his classroom, because I was the only Indian in cultural anthropology, because it was just verboten for us to even go there for a long time, tries to show his awareness of my ethnicity by implying that I was French Indian with my name. And just, well, Devan, is that French? Well, the implication is that that's French Indian. No, that's not French. Now I'm embarrassed. Now I've been singled out. He hasn't asked Smith. He hasn't asked, Jorgensen. He hasn't asked any of the other people in that class what their nationality was. And I mean, it was horrible to be set apart from. All I wanted to do was belong. And I'm sure it never dawned on him that that's what he was doing. I mean, I think things can backfire so quickly because there are assumptions made on all sides because we're uncomfortable to have these conversations. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I appreciate you asking. I really do.
Thank you. No, it does. It does. And I think that adoption has so many facets, and, adoptees have very much this common experience of grief and loss. And then as you add your other identities on top of that, it just compounds. In my opinion, as a layperson who's just talked to hundreds and hundreds of adoptees every day. But I know we're wrapping up. I wanted to just share that I'm an avid podcast listener, and in preparing for this, I wanted to make sure I had a couple other resources to send adoptees to, especially for folks that have no idea. We're talking about ICWA. You're like, what is that? And there is a fabulous podcast series out right now. I don't know if you've heard it at all, Susan, but it's called This Land. And in season 2, they specifically focus in on what you were describing to us earlier. So if you go to This Land in your podcast app, you'll find it. The host is an Indigenous woman, and I'm going to be trigger warning. When you listen, you will be angry. You will feel sad. They're talking to adoptive parents, but many adoptee voices are represented, and they're journalists. So they're really unpacking and proving some of the things that, you shared with us today. And so if you're interested in further research in that's like very timely. They're really talking about the cases that are going on right now as we are recording this show in fall of 2021. You can hear some journalists digging into that. So I just wanted to share that with you. But is there anything else that you want to share with us about, being an ally? Is there any actions that adoptees can take to be standing on the side of, keeping Indigenous children with their families?
I think when I talk with adoptive parents, when I talk with adopters, the things that I really try to get across from them is, number one, that child needs to grow up with people around them who look like them. That is absolutely key. They need to know and understand real stories of what it means to be Indigenous. that have pride, that show belonging, that have authenticity. They need to at least be aware of their siblings and their extended family. You know, I understand why children are removed from parents sometimes, because it's unsafe in a variety of ways. But they don't need to be removed from their entire family. When I met my sister Ronnie for the first time in 1993, she and I created such a bond because we could sit and talk about our adoption placement openly. You know, there were no assumptions of how wonderful it was. There were no assumptions of just being made to feel certain ways under certain circumstances, whether that's being made to feel less than, being made to feel embarrassed, being made to feel ashamed. And I think it's also important to note that when we want to go home, when we want to do that search and when we want to go home, it has nothing to do with the adoptive parents. That has to do with finding us. And when I talk with adoptive parents who have worked really, really hard to do all those things that I've kind of lined out, I appreciate the work they've done because it's not easy. It's not easy watching the child that you've raised perhaps face rejection. It's not easy watching the child you raise not getting the help that they need in school. You know, it's not easy to help the child you're raising to be made fun of on the school playground. A lot is asked of them. They need to step up and they need to stand up for that child. It doesn't matter what the neighborhood might think or what the teachers might think or what other parents might think. I think, you know, for people along the sidelines, support, I don't know. It's just so difficult because really all they can do is really learn about the history and understand the ramifications and the complexities of adoption and the complexities it brings, and step out of their skins. And even if they could think about their own family, what historic trauma existed in their family line. And I think the more connection you can find, the more you can help adoptees and more you can help adoptive parents be the strong people that they need to be.
Yes, beautifully said. I appreciate that. Thank you. And, you know, your memoir, which I want to recommend, Bitterroot, is just a wonderful view, like, of how you came into your identity in your 40s, and you really take us back and forth and have all these different moments. And, you know, it really is a very intimate view of your experiences. And I know that comes at a cost, being that vulnerable. So I really appreciated that. And you weave history of things that I really had no idea about. I've read much more on the Canadian Indigenous experience, like I mentioned before, the 60 Scoop in residential schools. So it was very good for me to learn more about the American experience and American and Indian experience. And I really appreciated that. So highly recommend. We're actually reading Bitterroot for our book club this month, which is wonderful. I'm so excited. And I will link to that. And I'll also link to your academic book that people can grab or borrow from the library, Mixing Cultural Identities. We've mentioned it before, through Transracial Adoption, Outcomes of the Indian Adoption Project from 2008. And you're speaking at a conference, and I asked you to come on because we wanted to make sure people knew about it. The Alliance for the Study of Adoption and Culture conference is coming up right away at the time we're recording this, so I'll link to that. But Susan, do you want to talk briefly about what you're going to share maybe in your keynote for that, and then what you want to recommend to us?
So my keynote is going to be kind of what we talked about today, melding the past with a possible future. And, my future, because I take that past forward. And so my future is not like rainbows and butterflies. It's like, if we continue on this path, this is what it's going to look like. And so I'm pretty excited about that, because I think in a lot of adoption stuff, we get pulled into the stories, and those are important. But I'm kind of one of those people. It's like, oh, okay, so now you know my story. Now let's get into the weeds. That's what I'd like to do with this one.
Love that.
And then one person, Margaret Jacobs, wrote this fabulous book called White Mother to a Dark Race. And she really explores Indigenous adoption in Canada and the US and Australia and New Zealand, and how there's a connection through all those colonizing practices, that adoption was one of those things that happened in all four of those countries.
Susan, I am so glad we got to talk today. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. And I really hope people will read Bitterroot with us to get even just more insights from you, and come hang with us at the virtual conference. Would love to see you. But other than that, where can we connect with you online?
The best place to go is to my website, which is just www.susanharness.com. I've also got an author's page on Facebook. You can reach me on Instagram. I'm on Twitter a little bit, but definitely the author's page and Instagram is where I spend most of my time.
Wonderful. I will link to all your social places in the show notes for folks so they can connect with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being here.
So we did mention this in the interview, but I just want to let you know that in the show notes, there's a link to information about the ASAC conference, where Susan is one of the keynote speakers. And also there's information about our off-script Patreon book club, where Susan is going to be a guest on October 30th. And then that audio recording will be dropped into the Patreon feed for Patreon supporters of Adoptees On. So those are two opportunities. If you go to her website, you will see all the upcoming events. Susan is very active in the community. I've seen her in other book clubs. I have seen her give other presentations. So if you are listening to this too late to get in on either of those, I promise there is an event coming up where you can hear more from Susan. And please make sure you read her book and pay attention to things that are happening right now. I really agree with one of the things Susan shared with us, that it is our job to be educated on these matters, especially if we want to be an ally to other adoptees who hold additional marginalized identities. It is important that we come alongside. Thank you so much for sticking around, for listening to the show, listening to the adoptee voices that I bring you every week. I'm so honored to do that, and thankful that my Patreon supporters allow me to do this work. Adopteeson.com/partner if you want to join them. If you want to join our book club with Susan, or if you live, or if it's already past then you can grab the audio recording. And this is the last week I'm going to be asking for this. So if you want your voice on the Adoptee Remembrance Day episode, if you want to share your story, I need your recording by October 20th. And that is very soon. So go to adopteeson.com/ARD for Adoptee Remembrance Day and share what you'd like. I am so honored that you want to share your voice with others, with me. And thank you so much for listening. Let's talk again next Friday.